Hello, my name is Brant. Today is the 8th day of June 2020, and what I'd like to talk to you about is Michael Servetus. Um, Most people don't know who this guy is. The only people who would know anything about him would be due to what happened to him in Geneva uh, later on in his life. Um, Michael Servetus was a brilliant man. I mean, brilliant. He was born in Spain. He was what we would call versed in what we call polymath, meaning that he understood mathematics, science. He was involved in astrology. He was also involved in geography. He was involved in anatomy, medicine, pharmaceuticals, that is, pharmaceuticals, how to work with that, law, poetry, and eventually he would deal with the Bible and its those teachings that he went contrary with the Catholic Church. So Michael Servetus apparently was gifted and he attended colleges in France, and he was well versed there. He was able to do well enough to the point that he went elsewhere. He went. It seems as though when he was working as a practitioner with medicine, he was able to. Basically, he was so good that basically the others around him were jealous of him. In fact, one person tried to kill him. A medical physician tried to get rid of him because he was apparently so smart. Although we witnessed, though, apparently he had an issue of simply being so smart that maybe he was he was maybe filled with sometimes understanding these things. He had little patience with people when they didn't understand him. He eventually was involved with Charles V of France. So Michael Servetus spent most of his life in France. So education, and also with Charles V, he also went with Charles V to Rome, and this is where he begins to make his break away from the Catholic Church. He was completely frustrated with what he saw in Rome, with the pomp and all the quote unquote waste of money in his eyes. So what caused him to eventually, he did do this, and he became what we call an Anti Trinitarian. So he did not believe in the Trinity. He was also what we call an Arian. This was a teaching back in the early church that a gentleman named Arian in the Palestine area began to vigorously push that that the Father and the Son were not equal, that one was subservient. This is called Servetus doctrine that was taught by him. Eventually, he is considered a heretic in the early church. We're talking way back in the 300s, 300s. And his writings were done away with, most of them. But apparently, Servetus, Michael, was able to get in these schools and to read some of the Catholic writings at that time, and became a pretty good person that promoted these ideas. Well, when he did that, France is not exactly what we call good ground to be independent from Catholic doctrines, and he found himself in trouble. But before he did this, he was communicating with a couple of things I want to make sure. He was also the emperor's doctor in Vienna, in Austria. When I say emperor, that means in Austria. And he was, again, he just wasn't somebody that sort of showed up. He was he was in good regards with many people because he was a very smart man. He was a genius. Um, and he was what I call well-rounded in almost all the fields out there. And if he didn't know anything, he was willing to learn those things. So he was very open-minded about things. But where he got in trouble is eventually with John Calvin. Calvin wrote, they both went back and forth communicating by letters. And eventually, when he's back in France, Michael Servetus is discovered, even though Michael Servetus used different names, alias names, to basically try to cover up who he was. But eventually, his head reared again, that is, and he was in big time trouble. In fact, what he was preaching, the Anti Trinitarianism, would eventually be he was a threat, and the Catholic Church was not going to allow him to spread these heresies. So, without even thinking, Michael Servetus decided to go to Geneva, and at this point, Calvin was frustrated with him because Michael Servetus became what I would call, according to Calvin and William Farel, who was another reformer in Geneva, he lost his patience with him. And so Michael Servetus was not someone who was tenderfoot. In other words, he didn't walk around very gingerly, such and such. He showed up on a Sunday morning with John Calvin preaching at the church in Geneva. And when the end of the service was over with, he was arrested. And he was in prison. Now here's where it gets really ugly. Because John Calvin went way out of bounds in this deal. Way out. And it should give you an idea of how he was way above his approval. In other words, people don't understand this. John Calvin had a lot of power and in Geneva. He had the city council, and they're what we call magistrate reform faith and reformers. And these are what I call it, and this is the only reason why Reformation took place in some parts of Europe, was because of Zwingli and Zurich had the same support, city council. Luther had support with the prince where he was at Wittenberg, and Calhoun had city support with Geneva with the city council also. There are others who were doing this. It seemed to be Switzerland was far more open to basically to look at Reformation, while other parts were still dark. We'll find out essentially later on that Poland becomes open ground for those who are of the Anabaptist beliefs, also of the Unitarians, and also of others who are not what we call in the majority of the thinking at that point. But so what transpires is that Calvin does write to other areas, mainly to Basel and in Switzerland, and also in Zurich, to get their opinion on what to do. And the city council had no power to basically execute a person like Michael Servetus. That was not a part of. They would be called, what they would be done to them would be banished. They would no longer be permitted to come into the city again. But Calvin took it on himself to burn him to the stake. When I was in seminary, we talked about this, and it seems as though their viewpoint and my viewpoint at that point was simply is I felt that was a little hard on someone, but I was always told basically that was just a different times, and that basically there was anybody who was even a reformer was a threat to the Catholic Church. So in a lot of ways, there was fear on that side too. And let me explain another thing here is the Catholics are beginning to lose power in the 1500s based upon the Renaissance, which the Renaissance basically means simply is the opening up of people being able to read, go to the universities, which were starting, having books, and educating themselves. They'd gone away from the strictly Latin texts, began to gradually be written in the vernacular, which is basically the people's language in each country were written. And this began to shake the foundation of the Catholic Church. Also, another clerical issue that's going on is the move away from a rural society in Europe to a more cities become important for merchants. So now as trade, money is introduced in a lot of ways, no longer the bartering system at this point, and it's beginning to have an impact also upon the Catholics. When you're in cities, there's a lot more chances of meeting up with someone who has a minority viewpoint of something, and you can dialogue. That was the opportunity that presented itself. And another huge thing was going on was that the Catholics were fighting the Turks. The Turks were threatening Vienna, Austria, at this time in the early 1500s, and there was a real threat. It was a real threat that basically, if they did not hold them there in Austria and Vienna, then eventually the whole Europe could be taken over by the Turks. And so this is also a problem for the Catholics. And there's two major things that take place here, and this is why the Reformation began to take place strongly and got more and more hearers, and eventually those that began to follow it even more, was that many of the what I would call the churches that were in Catholics, you could buy that office. You could buy your own priesthood. Can you believe that? The Catholic Church they sold. Someone was there at a Catholic church. If I had the money, I could buy that area and collect money, and then I would give a certain amount of money to the Catholic Church in Vatican and in Rome. And yet I also took money for myself. So it's like a prince type of deal here. But yet you're also, you take care of the church. There are two major things that go on in a church at that time, which were very important for the common folks. And that was to have a marriage and to have deaths to take place. That is, to bury those who were involved in the church. The Catholics did use that threat enormously with people who longed to be married or to basically bury their loved ones. Now, this is enormous power, enormous. And so what takes place here is that they're selling these offices. That's what they're doing. They're selling the offices of the priests. The other thing that's coming along, which is basically what most people know about, is the indulgence that was taking place. And this is where Luther becomes involved immensely at Wittenberg, and eventually that's why he's adamant, even though he's a former monk himself, was that they were seeking money. It had gotten so corrupt in Rome that they were seeking money, and that those who paid so much amount of money they would free their souls and they would go to heaven. Yes, you heard that right. You heard that right. You could buy your soul a ticket to heaven. That's how corrupt the church got. I'm completely amazed that there's actually a Catholic church today existing. They have completely fooled everybody. Most people don't even know what the Catholics did. Have no idea. They seem to say, well, that was the bygones be bygones. Really? Well, if you look at their churches, there's gold and the best things you could experience in a church that is this marble architecture. And I doubt you know this, but when paganism begins to wane and after the deaths of many people who are Christians eventually get support from Rome, starts with Constantine and it gradually gets, there are some other emperors who come in and who do butcher Christians, and then eventually that changes roughly in the 400s or 500s, and that sets the stage that basically Christians now are protected in Rome far more, although they actually compromise their faith to do that. So when this happened, many of the pagan temples were destroyed. And here's a little known, most people, I don't think many people know this, but once they destroyed the pagan temples, they would come back and the Romans, the Catholic Church would come in and build right back on that same place. Because they understood at that point where the ley lines were in the earth. That's why. So almost a lot of temples Catholic cathedrals are built upon ley lines because of pagan temples beforehand. Most people don't know that. But anyway, back to Servetus. Eventually, he is burned to the stake. And Calvin makes that decision. And he was not given that power neither. So you see that we have someone who already out of control in Geneva. He's also not only teaches William Farel, he also teaches John Knox. So there's the two major guys. I believe that William Farel was the one who eventually goes into France and is part of the Huguenot Church. And then John Knox is the one who goes back to Scotland, where he's from originally, and he fights the church in Scotland to eventually bring about Reformation there. And that's why we have Presbyterians today, which is a Reformed faith also. Now, another clarification here for people who may not understand. Reformation means reform. It doesn't mean what many people think they started out anew. Sorry, that's not true. Reformation is reform. Reform means simply is that if there's certain things there that are good, you keep it. And so certain things that the Roman Catholics taught, the Reformers continue to teach those things. That's what Reformation means. And then Reformation means they build a foundation and then they put their beliefs upon that foundation that was eventually was a Roman Catholic, is now part of their belief system. So it's not a starting over of a completely new church. And that's why I've always, actually, I got out of church and saw these things, that I realized that basically the Reformation leaders and Presbyterians, Lutherans are basically a branch off the Catholic tree. That's what they are. They are a branch because they play with the communion services that take place, Eucharist, as they call it, and they only change it from transubstantiation to substantiation. So Some will look at it simply as the Spirit is there, but not. This is not an actual embodiment of the Jesus coming down, and you're drinking his blood and eating of his body. To me, that sounds satanic in the first place. Others eventually look at it as just simply a memorial, which is eventually what the Baptists do. But they don't depart from the Trinity. None of these guys depart from that, from what the Catholics brought up. And they go from there. They become very evangelistic. So they're not only interested in the being shepherds to the sheep, but also spreading their word to evangelize others to their truth, supposedly true. So I try to give you an idea. This was a brilliant man, Michael Servetus, enormously smart, and he died before, I think he was in his 40s when he was burned to the stake. And it amazes me. There was just no tolerance of this, of someone's viewpoint. What was the threat? Why was John Calvin afraid of this? One man. Well, probably he was a threat in some ways because he was a learned man. And if Michael Servetus had basically toned down his way of communicating, I think in some ways he would have had a chance to maybe create his own church, supposedly, or go in that way. He did meet Martin Bucer in the free city of, forgot it, Strasbourg. He met with them, so he was communicating with others who were in the forum. So he was looking for cohesion with what he understood, but they were not going to back down. Although Bucer and the others there in Strasbourg were far more open because it was a free city. And what I mean by free city, it meant that simply is that they could dialogue and not be threatened by death. That there was an opportunity for others to set up their churches in Strasbourg in a way that basically in other cities like Geneva or possibly Zurich or others in Basel that were quote unquote not allowed to do that. You see, Calvin had a monopoly on the city of Geneva. Luther had a monopoly on the city of Wittenberg. So you have to understand simply is they had already took their leader and they were going to follow him. Again, they were not going to be open. So Strasbourg was important in all ways to be able to dialogue with others. And this is an enormous opportunity as all this is going on. You have the Anabaptists also involved there, and we know that Michael Sadler went to also to Strasbourg and talked with Bucer and Capito, and they didn't agree because Sadler would not compromise on what he understood as being a Anabaptist. And he rejected, and this is key also with the Anabaptists, they rejected the state. They didn't want anything to do with the state. So eventually you knew that basically Anabaptists were going to be run after and chased after, and eventually, and that's why they didn't last long, because they were hunted down like pigs. So, but I've gotten off the tangent. Again, I would suggest you would look into Michael Servetus and look at what he did. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.